Hi, I'm Fel the Blythe, and this is one of the most difficult topics I've ever had to research, so strap in. I usually have my lights on in the background, but honestly, I kind of like it. I got my son. First of all, thank you all so much for your kind words and your support last week. October is always a very busy month for me, and I really wanted to get this video out on Halloween. It felt right, but, well. Anyway, what is this video going to be? Well, I'm glad you asked. This video is about Hekate. About partway through my prep for this video, I realized that it was not going to be possible for me to do a video about Hekate in one part. At least not without making it like 2 hours long. Well, I have been known to watch like hour-long YouTube videos before, and that's not unheard of. It made sense to me to split it up just because it feels more accessible, and also that way I can really focus on each part. So I decided to break it up. This video will probably be 2 parts. There's a chance it might be 3. I'll have to see how I feel when I'm through the second part. Part 1 is about Hekate in the ancient classical world, and then part 2 will be Hekate from the Hellenistic to the modern world. There's a really stark difference between those 2 Hecates, as we will see. But we'll fall off that bridge when we get to it. My obligatory not a scholar statement. I tried my freaking darndest to trace everything back to a primary source, specifically primary sources of the classical era or early historians, because there's frankly a lot of nonsense out there. But as always, I am not a scholar. I have never studied this in a university setting. Just because I share my opinions on the internet does not make me any sort of authority or expert. Cross-check me, debate me, start discussions with me. I'm not this inaccessible scholar. I'm just like you. And even amongst scholars, Hekate is hotly contested and has been for a long time, to the point where it's hard for even PhD classicists to really suss out what the heck is going on, what held actual validity. Again, not an authority, do not take me at my word. Speaking of misconceptions and confusions, myths and misconceptions, except not actual myths in that sense, just misconceptions. I'll get into her actual myths later. First misconception is the Maiden-Mother-Crone, which you will often see written in the acronym MMC. So many people see Hekate as a triunity Maiden-Mother-Crone. The Maiden-Mother-Crone archetype was actually made up by poet Robert Graves, poet, not archaeologist or historian. While he did study classics at Oxford, his studies were interrupted by the war and him just generally being the mess, which is, relatable. I actually really love Robert Graves' poetry. I think it captures being a young bisexual man trying to survive World War I in English society. I have a lot of feelings about Graves. Despite feeling kinship for all those who suffer from gay anguish like I do, I will still fist for him behind Astral Denny's. If any of you have copies of Greek myths from your parents, I am willing to bet that it's the Robert Graves edition. While his translations are beautiful and his retellings help new audiences, well, new at the time, understand Greek myths, his scholarship was, interesting. And one of the victims of this scholarship was Hekate. I'm not going to make a whole video about the MMC, but I think it's important to cover when talking about misconceptions about Hekate. He outlined this idea in his poetic text, an alleged scholarly work, The White Goddess. The MMC represented the 3 stages of a woman's life. First a maiden, then a mother, and then finally a crone. You can already see 100 problems arising from this. Man writes about the stages of a woman's life that is entirely centered around her ability to reproduce. He then retroactively applied this to Greek deities. I will note that it was originally maiden nymph crone, but again, this is not a discussion specifically on the MMC, just how it applies to Hekate. Wicca was heavily influenced by the White Goddess and Robert Graves, and a lot of early Wiccans helped to flesh out this MMC discourse around Hekate, because she is a triple-formed goddess. This is, that's one of her epithets. However, they then called these triple forms the Maiden-Mother-Crone. Never mind that she is never a crone, and only a mother in a couple of fragmentary sources. Next misconception, or problem area with Hekate, the problem of Hesiod and the Orphic hymns. The Hesiodic hymn to Hekate is notable. Hesiod, for those who don't know, wrote the Theogony, one of the most influential early texts that outline the literal theogony of the gods, how they came to be, and their stories. That's where we get the discussion of the 3 generations of the gods. I'll probably do a whole video on the Theogony because it's super important. However, Hesiod was from closer to Anatolia, Turkey, than he was to actual Hellas. Now that's fine. Hellas, as a culture, spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Important to note that things that were happening in Anatolia were not always the same things that were happening in main islands. And his Theogony, specifically how it addresses Hekate, has confused scholars for quite a long time. First of all, he elevates Hekate above all other gods, even saying that Zeus honors her. This hymn confuses scholars because it contrasts pretty dramatically with contemporary other sources, like Homer, who's considered contemporary with Hesiod, mentions Hekate not at all in the Iliad and the Odyssey, although in the Homeric hymns, but did he really write the Homeric hymns? The point is, she is not mentioned at all in the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is one of the other most important Greek texts. So the fact that in the Theogony, she's considered super important, second to Zeus essentially, but then she's not mentioned at all in the Iliad and the Odyssey and other contemporary texts has confused scholars because they're like, what's going on here? Here's what Sarah Iles, Johnston.
Without further ado, I give you Sarah Johnston.
Oh, she didn't say that.
It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Sarah Iles Johnston comes to us from the Department of Class.
Here's what Sarah Iles Johnston had to say about it. One theory is that Hesiod's original village had a substantial Hekate following, and that his inclusion of her in the Theogony was a way of adding her to her prestige by spreading word among his readers. Another theory is that Hekate was mainly a household god, and humble household worship could have been more pervasive yet not mentioned as much as temple worship. The other theory is that Hekate was his family's patron goddess. Then he would want to obviously honor her quite a lot. So looking at the Hesiodic hymns can be quite confusing. Actually, looking at anything about Hekate is confusing, so I guess. But moving on from Hesiod, Orphic hymns. This video is not about the Chaldean oracles or the Orphic hymns. Both were mystery cults and not the common religion, which is the focus of this video. So I will not really be discussing them at all. If anything, that would be in a part 2. A lot of Hellenic polytheists, myself included, use the Orphic hymns in our praxis. However, it's important to note that that would not be going on in the common religion, especially in the classical age. Orphics were a mystery cult, so definitely not a part of the public consciousness. Also, they were not written into like hundreds of years after the classical era, so of course they wouldn't be used unless they were like seeing the future. They were written during the Hellenistic era. Do I explain what the Hellenistic era is? I feel like I do this literally every video. I should just honestly get it tattooed across my forehead and just being like, ding, ding, ding. Next, misconception. And this one might get a little bit controversial, so strap in. This is not No Nuance November. This is Nuance Full November. Goddess of witches. How much is Hekate really a goddess of witchcraft? If you look up Hekate, number one thing that comes up is Hekate, goddess of witchcraft, coming soon to a praxis near you. This is another idea that scholars have verbally fist-fought each other over for years. One of the biggest issues with researching Hekate is historical retconning, essentially looking at the past with a modern lens, or rather a lens other than what is contemporaneous to its own time, whether that's looking at the classical era through the eyes of a Wicca woman's live journal site, or through the eyes of Shakespeare. Each one has the ability to cloud our judgment. By the Roman age, Hekate was already literarily associated with witches and witchcraft, and Ovid even calls her a goddess of witchcraft. However, Ovid also said a lot of things that make no sense and had no evidence in praxis, so take that with what you will. However, how closely connected she is to witches prior to the Romans is shaky. Even in the PGM, the Greek Magical Papyri, one of the biggest magical texts of the Hellenistic era, she is invoked not because of her witchy nature, but because of her association with spirits. That is a big distinction to make. We, in the English language, have a habit of lumping everything that is occult under magic, witchcraft, but in reality, language is a lot more complicated than that, and something that we call witchcraft they might not have referred to as witchcraft. That's one of the many reasons why English is extremely confusing. Johnston points out that The Hekate witch narrative is a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Hekate has long been associated with the liminal because of her associated with entrances and crossroads, and the liminal and crossroads were associated together, and then they would become associated with spells and witchcraft. Were crossroads witchy because Hekate was, or did Hekate become associated with witchcraft because spirits and spells were associated with crossroads? For a long time, scholarship was in the first, that crossroads were witchy because of Hekate, but now it's tending to fall into the second, that Hekate became witchy because crossroads were associated with witchcraft. The witch Medea is quoted as saying, "My chosen helper, Hekate, who dwells in the inner chamber of my house," i.e. the household shrine. Hekate was already associated with the restless dead and uncanny by the time that Euripides wrote this, which would be in the classical age. It makes sense that Medea, being a sorceress, would go to her for help. Medea is not necessarily a witch because of her closeness with Hekate, but likely because her father Aeschylus was a fearsome sorcerer. There are also many readings of that line, "the inner chamber of my house." Some people say that this implies that Hekate was a household goddess. I tend to take the viewpoint that Euripides is trying to drive home the fact that Medea does not keep Hestia in her household shrine, but rather that she's so and maligned that she has a goddess of the uncanny in her hearth instead of Hestia, who is the hearth itself. I'm not sure we'll ever know how much Hekate was really associated with witchcraft in the classical age beyond being associated with the things that would later become associated with witchcraft. Lots of hoops we're jumping through here. However, since the Roman period, Hekate as a deviant witch has been pretty ingrained in the public consciousness, so a little too difficult to suss that out. Here's a quote from Johnston that'll make you think. "It was the dominion over restless souls that led to Hecate's familiar role as a magician's goddess as well, for control of a soul was essential to most ancient magical procedures. Our first hints of this idea come from the fragment of Sophocles, where Hekate is asked for help in preparing in a spell, and from Euripides, whose Medea refers to Hekate as the goddess who dwells close to her hearth. Later, Horace's dreadful witches demand that Hekate help them to invoke the souls of the dead, and she frequently is asked by magicians of the imperial age to help them gain control of Aurore and Boetoia, the souls of those who have died before their time or violently." So which came first, the witch or the goddess? Another thing that's hotly debated is how scary Hekate was to the ancients. A lot of literary sources seem to present her as a fearsome deity, but yet the Hekateia, a three-sided protected statue found in households and at crossroads, and we have evidence of offerings to her at temples. Additionally, we have the Homeric hymn to Demeter and the Hesiodic hymn that paint Hekate as this benevolent deity. Tender-hearted, she's even called. Pindar, in a much later source, refers to her as a kindly goddess. In the general theological viewpoint, gods who averted something were also the gods who could send it forth. Hence Apollo, protector against disease, could also send it on, and Hekate, protector from ghosts, could then therefore be invoked to unleash ghosts, which is what the magicians would do in further her fearsome aspect. But Hekate is also Kurotrophos, caretaker of the young. Knowing how many charms there are against any sort of thing that is a threat to children, if Hekate was so fearsome, why would one of her oldest aspects be childcare? So who is the real Hekate? Well, that is what I'm hoping to outline for you today, or outline these stories, variations and contradictions, and evidence of cult worship, and present them to you, and then you can see what resonates for you in your own practice. Hekate is probably one of the most, if not the most complicated and convoluted deity in the Greek pantheon. We're gonna start at the beginning, the myths of Hekate and her origins. We're gonna start simple as we can, and go with what we know. I'll move into worship and other things in a moment. By most accounts, her father is Perseus, Titan of destruction. His name literally means to sack, to ravage, and destroy. And generally, the consensus is that her mother is Asteria, Titaness of falling stars. However, according to some authors, she is the daughter of Zeus and Asteria. Or maybe Zeus and Demeter, or scratch all that, and maybe it's just Nyx and somebody? Maybe some god named Eurystheus, which would be weird considering he's the son of Apollo, and Hekate is generally accepted to be a Titaness. Yeah, this is the simple part. So I just mentioned Hekate is a Titaness. In Greek cosmology, there were 3 generations of gods: the primordials, who are usurped by the Titans, who are usurped by their children, the Olympians. Although not every Titan's kid was an Olympian, some of them were other Titans, like Helios, Leto, and Hekate. Then there was the Titanomachy, a 10-year war versus Zeus and his Olympians and Kronos and his Titans. Zeus prevailed and he banished them from the heavens and imprisoned them in Tartarus. Except, many of the Titans received cult worship in ancient Greece, meaning they had religious followings, including Kronos, who most people view as the BBEG of Greek mythology, but he did actually see some worship. Additionally, Rhea, his wife, was synced with Cybele, who had one of the most pervasive mystery cults the Western world had ever seen, spread from Anatolia to Greece to Rome to Britain. And then you have worship of Hekate, worship of Helios, worship of Leto and Selene. So how locked up were the Titans if people were worshipping them and building temples to them and praying to them? In the Theogony, for Hekate at least, Hesiod does specify that because Zeus honored Hekate and she helped him, he did not take anything away from her. But as I mentioned, the way that he treated Hekate was very unique for his time. Usually Hekate is depicted as having no children or consort, so she's a maiden goddess. However, some later authors depict her as having been the mother of the witches Hekate and Medea, as though others view her kind of as a weird consort to Chthonic Hermes, although that one is like one fragment. Next thing on our list with Hekate is the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Her next big break, and probably biggest literary role for her, is in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, aka the abduction of Persephone. For those who are unaware, this is the story of quote-unquote winter, in which Persephone is tricked into the underworld by Hades, eats the pomegranate, becomes a part of the underworld, and then a deal is struck in which she spends 2/3 of her time with Demeter and 1/3 in the underworld. Why 3rd and not 4? Well, there was only 3 seasons. That hymn has been the subject of many articles and books, so I'm not gonna get into the nitty-gritty here, but rather I'm gonna examine specifically the role of Hekate. Hekate is first off described as the playmate of Kore, Persephone in her girl form. This implies Hekate as fairly young. Once Persephone is abducted, next to Helios, only Hekate is aware of where she has gone, perhaps signifying her chthonic aspect. She helps Demeter to look for Persephone, and once they are reunited, Hekate becomes Persephone's confidant and watches over her. This makes sense given Hecate's association with the underworld, as well as a kurotrophos, a child carer. It's interesting to me how few people I see worshipping Hekate and Persephone together, given how close they are depicted in Greek mythology. Medea. I already talked a little bit about Medea, but I'm going to talk about her again because we're talking about myths. Everywhere left and right, Hekate is intimately connected to Medea. Medea is a granddaughter of Helios and the daughter of Aeetes, most notable for marrying Jason of the Golden Fleece and then murdering all of their children and ascending in a golden chariot. Yeah, that's Medea. Medea's story changes quite a bit throughout history, as stories do. She's described as having Hekate in her hearth, like I mentioned. Medea is also described in the Roman Argonautica as being Hecate's priestess. Again, we have some chicken and the egg going on here. Was Hekate intimately tied to Medea because both were related to malignant spellcraft, or did Hekate become associated with witchcraft because she became more closely associated with Medea? There are many myths surrounding Medea and Hekate, most of them involving witchcraft and necromancy, which at the time were largely related. But the real Hekate, please stand up. Hekate has long been synced with a lot of gods. I'm going to discuss some of those, especially the ones that showed up in the classical age. Hekate, Artemis, Selene. Speaking of companions, Artemis is considered another playmate of Persephone, although this is not how Hekate and Artemis are linked. According to Sarah Iles Johnston, one of Hecate's earliest roles in Greek literature was that of a wedding attendant. This is the role that she shared with Artemis, who also blessed a bride's transitions from maiden to wife. Goddess of transitions was also Hecate's domain, and for both Artemis and Hekate, this included childbirth and child care. Aeschylus speaks of an Artemis Hekate who brings labor pains to women. There's also evidence of offerings to Artemis Hekate in hopes of a good birthing process. Additionally, Hekate was sometimes honored in temples to Artemis. By the 5th century BCE, Artemis was already starting to be heavily associated with the moon. Hekate had her own growing association with the moon, which would further link these two goddesses together. By the time of the Chaldean oracles, we would have evidence of invocations and literary references to Artemis Hekate Selene, or Artemis Hekate Persephone, in which Persephone, Kore, and Hekate are all terms that Plutarch uses for the moon. Oenotia, who often people just think of as just an epithet of Hekate, was actually a Thessalian goddess, whose name means in the road. During the classical age, she was predominantly a goddess distinct from Hekate, although they would later become distinct so much to become one goddess. And we can see some very strong similarities between the two of them. Enodia was not only a crossroads deity, but one who protected children and guarded the home. Enodia is the keeper of the keys, the original keeper of the keys. Several votive offerings were found to her with keys in the base, although ultimately we do not know much about Enodia except for the crossroads associations and associations with the keys. She also seems to have some associations with magic and spells and the dead. However, in the ancient world, there was already a pervasive stereotype about Thessaly and witches, so this could have just been further propaganda about Thessaly. Again, that's really hard to suss out. Hekate as Iphigenia. Speaking of Hekate and Artemis, one of the other myths associated with her is the myth of the heroine Iphigenia. Iphigenia? It's gotta be Iphigenia.
Iphigenia.
Iphigenia is the daughter of Agamemnon, who sacrificed her. This would then set off a chain of events, which would lead to him being killed by his wife and her lover, and then she is then killed by Orestes, who then seeks Athena's counsel, and Athena's like, y'all gotta learn how to solve this other than just killing people, and now we have 12 jurors. Yep, we in the United States can trace back our jury system to Greek mythology. But that's not what this video is about. In several versions, Iphigenia either survives and becomes a priestess of Artemis, or she's apotheosized by Artemis and turned into an immortal heroine. In a Hesiodic fragment, Pausanias states that Iphigenia was not killed, but by the will of Artemis became Hekate. There was also a temple of Hekate in Argolis, in which Hekate is identified as the apotheosized Iphigenia. So that's pretty interesting. This also continues in her domain not only of maidenhood, like Iphigenia would have been a maiden, but a transition between life and death. Oh, where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from? Where did Hekate even come from? Scholars have gone back and forth on this. The general consensus is that she comes from Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, especially given that the Hecate root of names there, meaning those theophoric names I mentioned in my Protections and Hellenism video, names given in honor of a god. We have a lot of Hecate roots over in that area. And more specifically, the town of Legina have the oldest and most extensive evidence for Hecate worship. Titles like Greatest and Most Manifest Goddess and Soteira, Savior, were found there. In fact, Caria had many significant sanctuaries and temples to Hecate, whereas in Greece only Aegina seemed to have any significant sanctuary devoted wholly to Hecate. Legina is where we begin to see the association between Hecate and keys, as there was a festival of keys in her honor, specifically the procession of the key. And statues were erected at city gates, where she was expected to watch over them, not unlike the Hecatea spoken of for. As Sarah Iles Johnston says, a deity who could watch over a city can watch over a house. However, enter 2018 at the Selinunte Archaeological Park in Trapani, which is in Sicily. The oldest direct evidence of Hecate's cult worship was found. Her perspective, Trapani is over here, and here's Legina. Trapani is like the farthest end of Sicily. So how the heck these two things were found, dating back to around the same time period, is anybody's guess. To counter this, the oldest votives from 7th century BCE to Hecate were found in Miletus, which is a city in Caria near Legina. Where is Hecate actually from? Sicily, Caria, somewhere in Greece? I don't know. But it's clear that her worship was very old and very widespread by, like, the 7th century BCE. So that just makes it more confusing because then they each have their own opinion on Hecate. And, yeah, that's kind of why I took the week off last week, because I was like, Domains. I would say the Hecate's domains can best be understood as transitions from girlhood to motherhood, literal transitions from space to space, and then transitions from life to death. As already stated, her earliest associations are of wedding attendant with her 2 torches. She also tends to Persephone as a girl, and then after she has transitioned to a wife. She is the torchbearer. Perhaps one of the oldest images of her with torches. This is a pretty fun one of her beating up a giant with her torches. What an icon. She, Enodia, and Artemis are all synced together with the birthing process and are sought after as kurotrophos, caretakers of children. As I mentioned, keys were seemingly offered to Enodia and household shrines in exchange for protection for their children, and then keys also became associated with Hecate. Protection is a strong aspect of Enodia and of Hecate, which leads me to my next bit. Transitions between liminal spaces. Hecatea were found in Hellas from the 5th century onwards. Hecate are the 3-sided Hecate that would point in each direction of the road, guarding doorways and crossroads. Marriage. As Sarah Iles Johnston points out, many thought that those restless spirits were always waiting for a door to be left unguarded, a window open so they might sneak inside. However, by the time Hekate arrived in Greece, Hermes was already filling this function as liminal and crossroads deity. Hermes was also associated with ghosts and dead, which is why it's fascinating to watch Hecate's associations with the liminal take a turn for the nefarious in late antiquity. Why did that not happen to Hermes? Hekate watched over the crossroads, household, and any other spaces to protect from those who should not be crossing them. Transitions life to death. As Sarah Iles Johnston says, no figure is more closely associated with the returning souls of the dead than Hekate. Despite Hermes' role as psychopomp, Hekate wins out in the public consciousness for dealers of the restless and the necromantic. This is likely helped out by our magicians of the PGM, Greek magical papyri, as keeper of the crossroads. This makes her keepers of the ghosts, and as keepers of the ghosts, this makes her keepers of the magicians, both to ward against them and to help. But Hecate's legacy. I honestly feel like I was barely even able to uncover and disentangle the story of Hekate. There's a demand I'll do a part 2 of her in the Hellenistic age to the modern age, where we're leaving Hekate. She has gone from a goddess of weddings and childcare to a slightly terrifying goddess associated with magic, necromancy, and ghosts. But we can see her through line of transitions throughout that journey. Hekate would continue to evolve and become one of the most important mystery goddesses, linked to Theurgy, the cosmic soul, and described as mother of the entire cosmos. However, this was not the belief in the classical age, at least not in the common religion. Hekate is so complicated. For many reasons, she was so widespread and was such an ancient period and clearly had different prioritizations in different polis, some really not even caring that much about her, and some being basically their town's patron. Unlike with Zeus, there was no real push to clarify or unify her story. Besides the already confusing discussion I had on the Tapenon, we have no surviving festivals and no temple remains intact. Her story is in pieces, which makes piecing it together that much more difficult. And I'm not going to do that for you, only laying out a less convoluted and clearer picture of who she might have been, which can inform who she is now. Some modern worship considerations. What does modern Hekate worship look like? Well, I will probably do a part 2 in which I discuss more into how she transitioned to where she is today. And honestly, ask like 5 Hekate devotees and you'll get literally 5 different answers. She's worshipped and worked with from Wiccans to modern witchcraft practitioners to Hellenic polytheists, and everyone is different. This surprises some people, but I don't actually have a praxis with Hekate. I've always felt distanced from her since I found her so confusing. The research aspect of this video actually helped clear up Hekate a lot for me, and actually this past Samhain, I did a little thing that involved her, and I'll see how that feels. It's still difficult for me to interact with an entity that we either don't have a lot of research on, or one where they're like very complicated, and a lot of the research we have has been kind of like corrupted by the Victorians. In terms of modern worship, she is a chthonic deity, especially in the classical world. Here's my altar, shrines, and sacred spaces videos. Oh, no, what's that? Right after that is my all about offerings videos. I talk more about what those mean and how to make offerings. Honestly, offerings to her can just kind of be what I state in that video of dedications or offering red wine and then not drinking from it. Honestly, that's really all you need for Hellenic polytheistic offerings. They're really not that complicated. I know people dedicate keys, people have key necklaces. It's also interesting to me that you don't often find people who are not devotees. Like, people either are devotees of Hekate or they don't interact with her at all. I do know people where there's a middle ground where she is a part of their praxis and their personal pantheon. They interact with her more casually, which honestly is fine. That's kind of what would have been done. You would have gone to her in times of need, like during when you're having a baby or needing to talk to someone who has passed on. So you don't need to have like this really intense devotional relationship with Hekate. I know that's kind of contradictory to what a lot of people say about Hekate, but that's how things would have been done back then. It's not like every single person would have been a devotee or priestess of Hekate. Well, I have a lot of complicated thoughts about modern priesthood, but that's discussion for another day. But from a common religion perspective, you can just honor her when you need to, when you feel called to, add her to your personal pantheon. You don't have to make her like a patron. I also have complicated thoughts about that. You don't have to have this really intense relationship with her. I mean, I certainly don't. I really only have gone to her a couple of times, and I'm still trying to sort out how I feel about her. You also don't need to interact with her at all. I hope this was helpful to discuss the classical and ancient view of Hekate. I make these videos for free. Like I said, I got a little bit overwhelmed at work this past couple months, so it would mean a lot to me if you could support me on Ko-fi I'll have that linked down below. It really does mean a lot to me. I also will link below the podcast I'm a part of with 2 other wonderful individuals called Test Tubes of Cauldrons, the intersection between science and spirituality. And I will link all my sources below. And if you would like a second video about Hekate from the Hellenistic era to the modern era, please let me know and I will make one. My camera's about to run out of me. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know if you have any questions or other thoughts. I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much and goodbye.